We're talking with JaimieHoffman, who is a lecturer in the Communication, Education, and University Experience program at CSU Channel Islands. And Jaimie, as you will see, teaches a lot of different connected courses. Let's get started on that. You teach one on diversity in higher education.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
That class in particular it was primarily face to face actually. But what I did is I made that class open. The class was really aiming at diversity and social justice in higher ed. And one of the things that we did in the class that I actually kind of wasn't sure how it would go because it's for new transfer students who are just getting acclimated to the university in the first place. But after every class session, I had them blog as a reflection of what we discussed in our previous session. And then they were required to do the reading for the next week and do a little bit of analysis of the reading. Because the class meets once a week on Fridays. And I had experienced in the past that they would do all of the reading at the last minute on Thursday night if they did it and they weren't prepared, and that made for our class sessions to be pretty challenging. So anyway, I had a due date of Tuesday, so that added a nice midweek point. And I wasn't sure, again, how blogging would go because they were talking about some fairly personal things as far as their reflections on social justice, but they were required to comment on each other's, and then occasionally I asked them to sort of bring in an image from the internet that represents your thoughts, for instance, on students with disabilities. And the pictures that they brought in were pretty amazing. But the reflections, what I found was that I feel like the fact that they were blogging made their reflections informal, which I think was good because the idea was to capture their thoughts and feelings about what we covered. And then their comments on each other was pretty powerful because there were some very, very quiet students in the class. And they had these amazing thoughts that they didn't share in the face-to-face session. And then they got validated by their peers, like, oh, yeah, I thought it was really intimidating talking about our personal identity as well, but they encouraged each other and congratulated each other. And so I really found through that class the best utility for blogging, which is primarily, at least in my perception, reflection and commenting on each other's reflection. So that was my primary use of it was just open for that class. I didn't do any sort of connections with other institutions.
Was this the first time that you had students blogging on the open web, or had you had experience with that before?
I had no experience with that before. I attended over the summer the DML workshop in Irvine, not really knowing hugely. I mean, I've taught online and I've taught blended in the past, but I didn't really know what open and connected really involved. And so I've actually, my own definition has been building over the last semester, but this was my first time. And I had 5 classes, 2 sections of one class. So I had 4 different classes that I made open and put on the web. And only one of them, I didn't have the students blog, and that was public speaking, mainly because I just think that's intimidating enough, but I did put my course website open for them to access.
I'm interested in what your definition has become of open connected learning.
Well, I guess my definition of what I thought connected has mainly been reaffirmed, but at some points I swayed away. So over the summer, I thought, okay, what connected is this truly aligned learning experience. And what I mean by that is, that the individuals who are connecting, the professors, they have these conversations. What are our combined outcomes? What do we really want to achieve? What do we want the students to get out of it? And then what's the best way to do that? And then really trying to make it feel like a synchronous, I guess, experience that is asynchronous, ironically. But that was my vision. And then I started to realize that, oh, maybe that's too connected. I saw other people's work. They were just connecting sort of by having people, and this is just a preliminary view of what I've seen, but some people's definition is just plugging people in. They plug their students' blog posts in, and they all are blogging together, and that's connected. So, but for me, being trained in sort of education as well as assessment, I really have a vested interest in making sure, okay, what are the common purposes? So a good example is what I actually did with my group communication class and my friend in Japan. So a friend of mine I went to high school with, he's teaching English in Japan. He's been there for about 15 years. And I just thought, okay, I think one of the most powerful things to use a connected experience for is connecting internationally, I should say. And so I thought, how can I do this? Well, I don't know someone who's teaching group communication in Japan. But then I thought, or in another country for that matter. But then I thought, well, no, this could be broader. So I contacted my friend and we did a module together. And it was based on this definition that I just shared. So we literally aligned our outcomes. What do you want your students to get out? What do I? We ended up deciding that VoiceThread would be the best tool to achieve those outcomes. And essentially what the outcomes were, and they're written a lot more specifically, but we wanted students to be able to learn about diversity together, specifically Hofstede's cultural dimensions. But then we also wanted them to be able to ask each other questions. So mostly questions about diversity, but we also said, and you can ask any question. And one student said, a Japanese student asked the US student, so tell me, why is it that nobody washes or dries their clothes on lines in your country, considering the weather is often quite nice? And it's just kind of random, but my students thought that was quite funny. But they also talked a lot with the students there about homogeneity and the fact that people in Japan are very similar. And over here, not so much. We have a lot of diversity. So anyway, that was quite powerful. We did a reflection and it was really aligned. And it wasn't just, here's the blogs, comment on each other's blogs, but it was something that was really sort of, it took triple the amount of time I thought it would to plan it. And that to me is how I see connected being as far as for my definition, because I believe there needs to be a good amount of instructor presence through the conversation. And I have kind of, I don't know if I've explained it well, but that's kind of my vision for connected. But I guess, now I realize that my definition probably hasn't changed. I've just come to realize that it's okay that everybody might have a different definition of what connected is for them. And it's still quite an amazing opportunity for our learners to be able to connect, even if it is just plugging blogs in and commenting on others' thoughts.
And you had another course on liberal studies as well.
Yes. Yeah, so I taught the Liberal Studies capstone course. The theme of the course was Leading and Teaching for Excellence, and that was really pretty much primarily online and also open. And that class, the students created an e-portfolio, which was their own essential website. And we utilized WordPress, and the end products for that were really, really good. One student, I asked them to reflect on the process of creating an e-portfolio, and I really wasn't sure how it was going to turn out because there was a lot of apprehension and pushback, and sometimes the students thought I was evil for making them use so much technology. But one student said something like, I get this. I get having my own website is like an amalgamation of all of my work. And this is me. This represents me. And I can take this in the future. I can share my thoughts as I travel. One student is going to go and work on human trafficking issues in Uganda. And he's like, I can use this to communicate back with the States. And so getting to see them realize the connections they can make was pretty powerful. For that class, I also had planned that my students were going to create an online module about leadership. And they were going to facilitate it for the local high school. So I had a connection planned. And in all honesty, we got to the stage where we had a draft of the module. But I personally pulled the plug on it because I didn't feel like the students were prepared and I couldn't 100% trust that they were going to be facilitating to the caliber that I thought was necessary to represent our institution. Although I do have plans in the future to make that happen. I've restructured it a little bit in how I'm going to implement it. And also we're going to connect with a local elementary school that's based on technology and leadership. So that's kind of an exciting connection because to me, if you connect across the educational pipeline, there's so many rewards because you're giving the students the opportunity to not only teach and practice teaching, and the high school or middle school or elementary school students are learning about leadership, but there's also this element of peer mentoring and this informal connectivity that I think will occur where it can really inspire maybe an elementary school student to say, hey, I could go to college too because they're going to college. So I'm excited about moving forward with that. And as I mentioned, I did all 4 of my classes. I just went for it. I put them all open online, and I went to do 2 pretty significant connections. And I guess a lot of this experience is being willing to take risks and realizing that. Sometimes they just don't work out, and that was a good learning experience for me, and I was okay with it. And my students, well, I think they were prepared for it because I gave some warnings and said if the work isn't, coming in this kind of timeline, then we won't be able to do it. And some were disappointed, but I think you just have to be able to go with it because you have to keep your outcomes of what you want in mind, and I didn't think they would be achieved. So back to the drawing board for next semester.
So you mentioned reflection in regard to each of your classes, and
Yes.
how do you introduce and frame and scaffold reflection for your students when you ask them to do that? How would other teachers who are planning to do this? What would your advice to them be?
Well, I think for me, it's kind of a bit of a process that I went through. I first just let them define it for themselves, meaning I just said, please reflect your thoughts and feelings. And I just tried to make the expectations, both verbally and in writing, very clear, which is an important point. I've come to discover that even though you might tell your face-to-face students something to do online, it's also good to accompany it with an online brief instructional video. Here's what I expect. And the same thing with your online students, because for whatever reason, and the students told me this, I can write out, here's what I want you to do, but if I have a video to accompany it, they reported to me that made a big difference. So I do that, and then I just give feedback along the way of, you've done a really good job explaining your summarizing the reading. But next time I'd like to hear more about your thoughts and feelings and reactions. And something that I plan on doing in the future that was a learning lesson for me, so I'd give advice, is that when you're assigning reflections or blogging, it's also good to tell the students what your role in that process was going to be. So for me, I set up the expectation among my students that I was going to comment on every single blog that they wrote throughout the entire semester. And I didn't realize I was doing that necessarily as far as setting up the expectation. I just decided to front load and give a lot of feedback early on. and thinking then they'd know how to maintain. Well, then they started really liking getting my feedback on every single reflection and every single blog. And there was one week that I thought, I think that they're on the right track. They're good. Well, then they commented and said, "How come we didn't hear from you?" So anytime it comes to an online discussion or blogging or VoiceThread for that matter, what I will be doing more in the future is saying, here's how my participation is going to go with your blogs. And so that's something that I learned. So in going back, I would do the same thing as far as maintain active presence in their blogs to kind of keep scaffolding them toward the right direction. And then, but let them know that my participation will decrease so that allows more space for them to comment on each other's blogs, because whenever I commented, there were often less comments, and there were maybe even comments that went in very different directions than mine, because it was like they were afraid to touch what I said. So it's important to really be knowledgeable of what your presence is. And then also I should note that any critical feedback that I had as far as with the quality of their work, that I put in a separate format. I put my comments about that in our LMS in the gradebook. But I thought of it like an online or a face-to-face discussion. If I wanted to ask for a deeper response or guide in a bit of a different direction or ask for clarification, that was okay for me to put on an open blog comment. But anything critical was in the gradebook.
Wonderfully useful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman.
All right. Thank you.